On air is understandable politics. Today we move to Ukraine. Over the years of independence, entire industries in the country have degraded. Industrial giants that were renowned throughout the Union are now silent under the weight of decay. How they squandered vast inheritances and unique enterprises. A similar fate could have awaited Belarusian factories like Made, Belazid, MTZ, and others. Let's see what we managed to avoid. Only facts, you draw the conclusions. In 1990, Ukraine was a serious locomotive in key sectors. It was predicted to have the fate of South Korea, high-technology industry space, 30% of the military-industrial complex, and 20% of all Union machine building. Also, a tenth of the world's metallurgy. The fall was all the more painful. In just 4 years, industrial production would collapse by 35%. The market will decide everything, said unscrupulous Ukrainian politicians in the 90s. And that's what happened. 80% of enterprises were privatized by friends of former presidents Kuchma and Kravchuk.
Factories were sold for 1% of their real value. For example, Kryvyi-Rih, producing 10 million tons of steel a year, was privatized in 2004 for $800 million, 6 times cheaper than its real price. The buyer was Viktor Pinchuk, Kuchma's son-in-law. Kryvyi-Rih changed ownership again, a year later. Now it was the German concern ArcelorMittal. And this, oddly enough, is still a positive example.
The military-industrial complex was the first to suffer. Valuable Soviet developments instantly went to the West, while the rest were unwanted. Yes, some were still bought by the Russian Federation, but other enterprises had to be repurposed or closed, and machines and equipment were cut for scrap. Some spaces were leased to private firms, and workshops turned into warehouses for Chinese junk.
They clearly took the wrong path, say the remnants of industrial giants today. Although for a long time, Ukrainian freedom was an example for many countries, including Belarus. But total corruption, theft, and the Maidans led the country to a huge tragedy, culminating in a military conflict. Although the deadly wounds in industry appeared long before the hostilities.
In 1994, an unofficial privatization of state property began in the country. Red directors began to declare themselves heirs of Soviet enterprises and demanded state support for business development in new conditions. But all funds went not to modernize production or preserve and increase jobs, but served as a source of personal enrichment. The most coveted pieces were the coal and oil and gas industries. An oligarchy was formed under the state's wing. The largest clans became the Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kiev, Kharkiv, and Lviv. They would later influence Ukrainian politics.
The legendary Zazid held on quite well. The largest car manufacturer went into a steep dive starting in 2008. Production volume then fell almost sixfold. It turned out this was far from the limit. In 2014, the plant produced only 13,000 cars. A year later, only 4,000. In 2017, just over 1,000. A catastrophe for a plant with a capacity of 150,000 cars.
Zaporizhia left the Ukrainian market. In January 2019, not a single Zad car was sold. The lines of the Zaporizhia car plant for the production of passenger cars were mothballed, and in December, bankruptcy proceedings began against the enterprise. Due to the devaluation of the hryvnia and the low purchasing power of the population, the Ukrainian market shrank several times.
The plant was also hit by Ukraine's accession to the WTO. According to the organization's rules, Kiev was obliged to reduce customs duties on foreign cars to 10%. The law on stimulating car production was also repealed. As they say, the plant was strangled by the whole Eurovillage.
Few paid attention to the economic potential within the country, to any production, because in this political struggle, domestic industrialists were defeated by international speculators. And they, were not really interested, so they solved their financial issues. They were not interested in Ukrainian production. So the struggle, so to speak, of the Red directors and in principle Ukrainian industrialists, they lost this battle.
Another enterprise whose decline began in the 90s, Antonov. In the USSR, these were the best cargo planes, An-124 Ruslan. It took 2 decades for the Antonov sign to become a tombstone. Years of free life, 1989 to 2016.
In the EU, there's Airbus. In America, there's Boeing and more. So it was, to put it mildly, unprofitable for these corporations for aviation to exist in Ukraine, especially since Antonov planes were often better than European and American ones. This was especially true of the plane's simplicity. That's why half of Africa still flies on An planes. And of course, this story did not imply the existence of the Ukrainian aviation industry, as they were direct competitors to the Americans and Europeans.
The coup on Maidan was a shock for the enterprise. Almost immediately, one of its subsidiaries, the Kharkiv State Aviation Enterprise, declared default. In 2015, only 2 planes were produced. Then production practically stopped due to the severance of ties with Russia, from where up to 60% of all components came.
Since 2008, the Antonov concern was headed by Dmytro Kiva, a doctor of technical sciences, a hero of Ukraine. Thanks to Kiva's efforts, the Ukrainian aviation industry, despite all the difficulties, stayed afloat. However, the new Ukrainian authorities, in the spring of 2014, decided to remove Kiva from the leadership of the concern. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, the Antonov concern was one of the few things that numerous Ukrainian oligarchs had not yet managed to seize and plunder due to the desperate resistance of its head. Second, Kiva was always an active supporter of joint projects and integration of the aviation industrial complexes of Russia and Ukraine, believing that this path promised great prospects for both countries.
The only enterprise in Ukraine with a full cycle of aircraft creation successfully added to the list of the largest industrial losses.
After Kiev ceased military technical cooperation with Moscow, the Ukrainian enterprise ran out of Russian components. And in 2016, the plant did not produce a single new machine. The plant survived only through the repair and modernization of used aviation equipment. The enterprise tried to attract new investors and customers, talked about wanting to build planes in cooperation with Americans, Chinese, anyone. But the Chinese only wanted the blueprints and intellectual property, and the Americans were indifferent to the plant.
And this story is like a carbon copy. Here they once created the largest ships of Soviet times, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the missile cruiser Moskva.
After the collapse of the Union, Ukraine inherited an entire shipbuilding cluster. More than a dozen modern factories capable of building the latest ships of all types. This was 15% of the world's shipbuilding capacity. Now the country produces only 0.5% of the industry's products. Over the years of independence, factories often changed owners. Much was looted and sold for scrap.
The famous plant sank after Euromaidan. There were no major orders for more than 10 years.
It's funny, but instead of cruisers and frigates, the Mykolaiv shipyard recently mastered the production of stoves for the armed forces of Ukraine. Financial problems led to the plant stopping work in October 2017 due to the cessation of funding.
Later, the plant was turned into a repair base for the Ukrainian Navy. There's been no talk of building new ships at the service station for a long time. A similar fate befell the Kharkiv tractor plant. Once, the plant produced 100,000 tractors a year. Today, bolts and nuts for Polish equipment. Almost all workshops are closed. 30,000 employees have scattered. If Ukraine was quietly and invisibly robbed in the 90s, then the 2000s, the time of Rinat Akhmetov and Ihor Kolomoisky, saw the country literally divided as spoils in entire sectors. Akhmetov got all the metallurgy, Kolomoisky the oil, Pinchuk the pipe factories. The rule 1, squeeze everything out of the enterprise and leave it to die.
A striking example is Dnipro-Azot. The plant, the largest ammonia producer in Europe, was shut down in 2010. Ihor Kolomoisky decided that the giant's equipment would be more useful in Romania. Everything was taken there, down to the last machine, over several years.
In the hands of Dnipro-Azot workers, you could see signs saying, "We want to live and work here." Until recently, about 4,000 people worked at Dnipro-Azot. However, in mid-June, the enterprise was stopped indefinitely due to a gas price increase, which was one of the IMF's main demands.
An even bigger scandal erupted when it became known that Kolomoisky, after paying people a year's salary through the company's accounts, bought himself a yacht. Truly, for oligarchs and workers, the laws are different, but the outcome is the same: a mass grave of Ukrainian factories. In 2014, it became cold as the north for the Yuzhmash plant.
In Soviet times, Yuzhmash was a leader in Ukraine's space industry, producing up to 40% of all ballistic missiles. The plant was known for the Satan and Voyevoda missiles. By the way, the main market in sovereign years was Russia.
The giant secret Soviet enterprise was built to ensure nuclear deterrence. The workforce numbered about 50,000 people. The territory was 1,000 hectares, a huge number of above-ground and underground workshops. But in 2014, Kolomoisky became the governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region, and the circus began.
The publication Novorusinfo took the news of Kolomoisky's reign at Yuzhmash quite pessimistically. The first thing that Russian media recently warned about with concern. Now, all the strategic secrets of Yuzhmash will be handed over to Washington. Second, Yuzhmash will be liquidated. Not just closed, but liquidated. Completely destroyed, without the possibility of ever restoring this production.
In general, that's what happened. In 2020, the Verkhovna Rada had to amend the state budget law to cover the enterprise's billion-dollar debts. By the time the amendments were made, the number of workers at the plant had decreased tenfold, and they hadn't received a salary for 11 months.
Nowadays, about 5,000 people remain. Until the very last moment, they produced rocket engines and sold them to the USA. About 3 years ago, the plant was bankrupt, but with the start of the armed conflict, the USA hurried and started doing something. The state of the equipment after the Nutcracker's blow is unknown.
By the start of the conflict, Yuzhmash had already forgotten that they once assembled nuclear warheads. Only the production of the hull remained. This is also important, but the technologies sold to the Americans are already lost.
Instead of modernizing industry and developing new sectors, decline and closure of enterprises began. Instead of creating new jobs, a flow of unemployed people poured into Poland's strawberry fields and Russia's construction sites. Instead of reducing poverty, the standard of living fell. Corruption penetrated all spheres of life. Officials who were supposed to serve the people instead began to rob the country and accumulate enormous wealth under the protection of equally corrupt law enforcement representatives.
There was a period when you could grab everything if you were in power or connected to it. And when you took enterprises for nothing through vouchers and so on, it was clear you took them because you had the opportunity. But you didn't take them to revive production. You didn't even have the brains for that, but to resell and profit from it. But the negotiations were so complicated, yes, and there were few buyers who brought in the equipment only to see the same factories cut up for scrap metal destroyed. There are plenty of such factories.
The remnants of the Soviet legacy that hadn't been looted in 20 years of independence were finished off by Euromaidan, which steamrolled through all key sectors. There was no economic miracle after signing the agreement with the EU. Moreover, Ukrainian goods were not needed in the European Union, and one of the most serious economic crises for the country began.
The crisis hit the wallets of most Ukrainians hard. The hryvnia depreciated, prices and tariffs skyrocketed, significantly outpacing wage growth. Real incomes fell, GDP and the national currency rate dropped, industrial production collapsed, exports shrank. The break in ties with Russia played a significant role. All this triggered inflation and a range of problems with enterprise financing, rising external debt, and declining quality of life.
Instead of a European paradise, there was a record drop in GDP, exports and deindustrialization, devaluation and galloping inflation, a fall in real incomes and unemployment.
Ukraine lost high-tech industries over 30 years. Moreover, it is increasingly becoming a raw material appendage of the West. The Ukrainian state is largely unable to develop complex economic sectors. Ukraine lost its status as a space power. The country once had its own satellites, but today, no one talks about it seriously. After the 2014 coup, Ukraine even managed to ruin its aviation industry.
In 10 years, the hryvnia depreciated fivefold, and the economy became a cripple, unable to move without external help, that is, foreign financing.
Officially, inflation in Ukraine was 24.87% in 2014, while at the end of 2012, early 2013, deflation was recorded by the State Statistics Service. The record was 2015 with inflation over 43%, and the first year after the start of direct conflict. In 2022, prices rose by 26.6%.
It became clear that Ukraine is on a path of destruction. Brussels and Washington demand the sale of land, export of metal to the EU. Since 2014, 90% of machine-building plants have closed. If in 1990, industry accounted for half of Ukraine's GDP, last year it was 12%. The figures are worse than those in Africa.
Noticeable steel production has fallen from 40 million tons to 6. Up to 30% of all arable land has already been sold by Zelensky to the American fund BlackRock.
Independence was gained, but what next? Today, Ukraine is under external control. There is no independent Ukrainian leadership. American management envisions a different development for the country. This has now become completely obvious. They need a poor country whose population is brainwashed into believing that all problems stem from Russia being an aggressor. With today's policies, Ukraine is doomed.
Today, Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe by several indicators. Last year, the Ukrainian Prime Minister announced Ukraine's losses only for the period of hostilities.
We lost 30% of our economy, about 20% of our territories, and 3.5 million jobs.
And the national debt has more than doubled. Exports have also roughly halved. Spending has also increased several times more than budget revenues. Considering the population decrease, Ukraine's national debt per capita has quadrupled since 2014, and more than $1 trillion is needed to rebuild the country.
De facto, the country ranks last in almost all global rankings for economy and living standards. Moreover, these processes of economic degradation in Ukraine began long before February 24, 2022. It was also recognized as the poorest in Europe in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. Not to mention the loss of territories, mineral deposits, and mass migration.
Additionally, heavy indebtedness and dependence on creditors' demands force Kyiv to constantly make sensitive decisions for citizens. Significantly raising utility tariffs, cutting social programs, raising taxes, and so on.
Compared to the same period, food prices have risen 5 to 13 times or more, and utility tariffs 10 to 15 times, while real incomes have fallen by at least a third.
Ukraine wasn't ruined by war, it was killed over 30 years by a thieving elite, greedy oligarchs, blind nationalists. Now there's no industry, no future, only poverty and rare earth metals, which are almost owned by the US and British. And on this industrial grave, it's fitting to leave the inscription, "We chose the European path." Goodbye.